Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Gilded Age. Our question to think about here, what were the 3 themes of the Gilded Age? One of the key components of the Gilded Age is the dramatic economic growth. And as we'll talk about, this is tied to industrialization. And we think about iron, steel, and coal as some of the most important components of that growth. So coming into the story of the 3 themes of the Gilded Age, I want to begin with industrialization because that really drives everything else. By the time the United States celebrated its centennial in 1876, the country was fast becoming an industrial society. Developments earlier in the century had laid the groundwork, but the most spectacular advances in industrialization came during the 3 decades after the Civil War. At the start of the war, the U.S. lagged behind the other industrializations, as we saw on the graph, including Great Britain, France, and Germany. And by 1900, the U.S. had vaulted far into the lead with a manufacturing output that exceeded the combined output of its 3 European rivals. And one of the biggest issues that came up with the Gilded Age was the rise of big corporations. These huge enterprises were able to outproduce their smaller competitors, and in many cases simply swallow them up. But these big corporations were essentially unregulated and frequently used shady business practices against their competitors and even their own workers, and in some cases their own investors, in order to make a profit. The business world of the Gilded Age was booming, but it was also incredibly volatile. Part of the reason why we see this massive industrialization has to do with a group of men who were entrepreneurs, who were the risk takers. Their admirers called them the captains of industry, but their critics referred to them as the robber barons. So this is John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt. These men provided the innovative leadership that allowed these businesses and industries to take off. And so they were celebrated as the pioneers, but they were also criticized for their cutthroat tactics and their greed. The opulence of the Gilded Age is very clear when we take a look at how filthy rich these men were and how they spent their wealth so ostentatiously. One of the things that comes out of this conversation about the captains of industry or the robber barons is this idea of social Darwinism. And one little caveat here is that this is not a term that they would have necessarily been familiar with, but it's a concept that they were familiar with. So Herbert Spencer, was a supporter of laissez-faire economics, and he argued that the struggle for survival spurred self-improvement. And what's interesting about this is that Herbert Spencer believed that self-improvement could be inherited. And so the captains of industry and others throughout the Gilded Age are going to use the ideas of social Darwinism. And again, that term comes a bit later, but the idea is familiar here. These people are going to use social Darwinism to justify the accumulation of huge fortunes. And it also justified the building of these fortunes on the backs of workers whose pitiful wages kept most of them in desperate poverty. And it all made sense, of course, because wealth was the clear indicator to them of who was fit and who was not. So the ideas here are based very loosely on Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, that species adapt to their environment, that traits are passed along to the young. But Darwin never intended this to be implied or applied as a social theory. So that's what makes this different from the evolution of species that Darwin was talking about. And Darwin never used the phrase survival of the fittest. This is a social concept. And again, it justifies not only the accumulation of wealth, but treating people badly to get there. One of the things that you'll need to take a closer look at is Andrew Carnegie's essay on the gospel of wealth. That'll become a key part of your journal assignment. So I want to bring you back a little bit here to the imagery of the Gilded Age that I mentioned earlier, this idea that you have this surface that is shiny and pretty, but underneath you have something else entirely. And so if we think about the phenomenal economic growth of the Gilded Age as the shiny part, the part underneath are the issues related to the average American worker. And even though the massive economic growth led to somewhat of a rising standard of living for most people, the growth was not even. In fact, when we take a look at the Gilded Age, one of the shocking statistics is the inequity in wealth. So we are familiar with the concept of the 1%, but in 1900, if we take a look at the richest 2% of American families, they owned more than 1/3 of the nation's wealth. And if we look at the top 10%, they owned almost 3/4 of the nation's wealth. That is just mind-boggling. And for everyone else, especially for the factory workers, they're still quite bad. They're working long hours under dangerous conditions. The average work week in American factories was 59 hours. So that means that most people worked 6 10-hour days in a factory. And oftentimes there were no safety precautions, no sort of organization that was looking out for the workers' safety. There was no OSHA at this time. And so if a worker was injured, there was nothing to compensate for that. And in fact, take a look at this picture here. These are bobbin boys. So these are children who are working to replace the bobbins in this textile mill. And you'll notice this child is working with bare feet on moving machinery. It's just shocking. Children as young as 8 were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so not surprisingly, all of this is incredibly dangerous. To give you an example here, in 1913, there were around 25,000 workplace fatalities and over 700,000 serious job-related injuries in the United States in that one single year. So it's obvious from this scenario where the factory owners, the business owners, are the ones with all of the wealth and power. And so workers are going to have to come together as a group in order to have any kind of leverage against their employers. The concept of labor unions is not new, but what we do see in the Gilded Age are the rise of national labor unions. And one of the first is the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was born as a secret society, but eventually opens up to the public. And the Knights of Labor welcomed, quote, everyone who toiled, regardless of skill, creed, sex, or color. So if you earned your paycheck by the sweat of your brow, then you could be a member of this union. And I really want to emphasize the fact that the Knights of Labor were not segregated. This is true of many organizations during this time period. You know, take, for example, the Farmers Union. You would have the Colored Farmers Alliance or the Southern Farmer Alliance. And this is not a segregated organization. The other thing is many labor unions didn't allow women to join because a lot of times factory owners would replace men with women because they could pay them less. And so the thought was that women were bringing down wages. But one of the tenets of the Knights of Labor's philosophy is equal work for equal pay. This is the 1870s. This is a radical concept for their time, and sadly, kind of a radical concept for ours. But this organization blossomed because it wasn't divided by craft, by ethnic or other differences. And membership by 1882 was 42,000. By 1885, it was 110,000. And it soon reaches 730,000 members. But unfortunately, the Knights of Labor are going to be involved in a series of incredibly unpopular strikes. And so that's going to lead to the downfall of the Knights of Labor. In fact, the Knights of Labor make up the other component of the journal assignment, and we can see the contrast between their philosophy and what Andrew Carnegie was promoting. The theme of immigration is closely tied to the theme of industrialization because many of those exploited factory workers were newly arrived immigrants. And the history of immigration is very cyclical. Many of the things that we saw in earlier eras are going to be present as time goes on. So, for example, the push and pull factors. Push factors are things that push people out of their home countries, whereas pull factors are things that draw them into a particular country. But the immigrants of the Gilded Age are going to be different from the immigrants that we saw coming into the U.S. in years past. In fact, we often describe them as the old immigrants versus the new immigrants. So the old immigrants were those who arrived in the U.S. before 1890, and many of them were from Northern and Western Europe. So from Germany, from the British Isles, from Ireland. Mostly they were Protestant, with the notable exception of the Irish, who were mostly Catholic. And because many of these groups spoke English or learned English very quickly, they were assimilated very easily into the fabric of American life. And even the Irish, because of the number of Irish that were already here. But the new immigrants arrived after 1890, and many of them were from Southern and Eastern Europe. And the cultural differences are profound. And so they're going to have a more difficult time finding a place within American society in terms of assimilation. But contributing to that were the differences in religion. We saw huge numbers of Jews, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox Christians coming in, and that didn't necessarily fit with the profile of many native-born Americans as being Protestant. So assimilation for the new immigrants was often much more difficult than for the old immigrants. Just as what we saw with industrialization, I want to pull back in the imagery of the Gilded Age. So on the surface, we have this glorious patchwork quilt of diversity in American society, with people coming from all over the world to the United States. But underneath that shiny surface, we have serious issues. And the biggest of them is the issue of nativism. Nativism is described as an anti-immigrant hostility on the part of native-born Americans. And we see this in a variety of ways during the Gilded Age. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law to restrict immigration explicitly on the basis of racial and class criteria, but it would not be the last. The Chinese Exclusion Act banned immigration from China for 10 years, and it was later extended for an additional 10 years. We also see the prominence of nativism in American society with groups like the Immigration Restriction League, which was founded in 1894. And this organization was dedicated to saving the Anglo-Saxon race in America from being, quote, contaminated by alien immigrants. So our third theme coming in brings everything together, both industrialization and immigration, into the growth of cities in America. In fact, immigrants are going to be a major force in the growth of cities. By 1900, nearly 30% of residents of the major cities in America were foreign born. Between 1860 and 1910, the rural population of the U.S. almost doubled, but the number of people living in cities increased sevenfold. In 1900, 3 cities, New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia, had populations of greater than 1 million. When we look at sort of the gilded part of urbanization, we see these dramatic technological advances. The steel frame construction allowed for the nation's first skyscrapers. But of course, that's going to lead to developments of elevators, specifically the safety mechanism that prevents them from free falling in the case of an accident. Streetcars, first horse-drawn and then later electric streetcars, are going to allow the city to grow horizontally, along with bridges and subways that make it easier for people to live further from the city center and commute in. The downside of urbanization is crowding and filth. When the cities blossomed, they became crowded, dirty, and unsanitary. In fact, 19th century cities in general were filthy, disease-ridden, noisy, and smelly. They were filled with garbage, contaminated water, manure, roaming pigs, and untreated sewage. Both animal and human waste was a big challenge, as was maintaining clean water. There were frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid fever, and yellow fever as a result of the pollution. Crowded tenement apartment buildings were also an issue. It seems at first glance that these would solve a housing problem, but these buildings are described as 7 or 8 stories with 30 4-room apartments on a lot 25 feet by 100 feet. Between 4 and 16 families lived on a floor, and some city blocks housed almost 4,000 people. In 1900, Manhattan had over 42,000 of these buildings, and they housed over 1.6 million people. Not surprisingly, the mortality rate among the urban poor was much higher than the general population. So coming back to our questions to think about here, what were the 3 themes of the Gilded Age? So we had urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. And each one of these components has both a positive side and a negative side. So bringing back that illustration of the Gilded Age itself.